Rough Cut. Today I'm Bruce Maxwell, Director of the IOE here at MSU. And today we have Hailey Wilmer with us, coming from Colorado. I guess it's snowing hard. Hopefully we avoid that big snow. Hailey is a social rangeland scientist studying the intersection of cultural, political, and ecological systems and adaptive rangeland management. So it's a common interest of lots of people here. Originally from Livingston, Montana. She's a former high school teacher. But I assume that was in Livingston.
It was in Colorado.
Oh, in Colorado.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. She's now with USDA and Northern Plains Climate Hub Fellow. Hailey works with the Rangeland Resource Range Unit and across USDA agencies and agricultural stakeholder groups. Research that supports adaptive management of drought and extreme weather events. Hailey's research methods include qualitative interviews with folks, quantitative ecological monitoring, and document the decision-making process of family ranches in Colorado and Wyoming. So, big region to cover. She has a PhD in Colorado State and Rangeland Ecosystem Science, which she received in 2016. So, welcome.
Thanks for the introduction. I'm really excited to be back on campus. I spent freshman year here, and as soon as I was back, I could just like taste the dorm food. There's like a memory. So it's great to be here and to share some of the work that we've been doing. And I called my talk "Hope on the Hardgrass." So I hope you walk out of here with a better understanding of what the hardgrass is. If you came to visit me in Fort Collins, we're just little bit east of Fort Collins on the shortgrass steppe, and then the role of hope in natural resource decision making. So I've got a little bit of a promo video to get you kind of feeling, get you out of the snowy cold weather, although it's tropical today for Bozeman, I guess, to give you a sense of kind of where I'm working and what I'm working with.
East of the Rocky Mountains and west of the Mississippi lies one of North America's most important landscapes, the grasslands of the Great Plains. Here, land stewardship rests on the shoulders of ranching families and conservation groups. For generations, ranchers' livelihoods have depended on the sustainable management of both public and private grasslands. But this isn't easy. From year to year, rainfall varies from plentiful to scarce, which means there are large swings in how much forage is available for cattle. Drought can have devastating financial consequences for family ranchers and can threaten their ability to stay on the land. Conservation groups work to promote the diversity of plants and wildlife in grassland landscapes. But this region of the world is changing quickly. Habitat loss due to urban development, farming, and grazing practices is putting a squeeze on birds that live only in these grasslands. For some species, their populations are only a fraction of what they were in the 1960s. Despite a common interest in doing what is best for the land, ranchers and conservation groups do not often work together. In part, this divide exists because of misconceptions.
I think the biggest thing that people think is we just abuse the land, just turn our cows out and abuse the land and gather our cows and sell our calves and make millions, they all think.
I think one of the biggest misgivings about conservation and specifically TNC involved in land management like this is that we are often perceived as being a protectionist agency or organization in that we set land aside and never touch it. They assume that we are going to be anti-something, and no, we're pro working on the land and managing it for its conservation values.
You know, on the Pawnee, it's a complex ecosystem and the groups involved are numerous, and so the decision-making process is just as complex.
There's a lot of concern, especially when you have an intermix of private ranches and public land all interspersed. Then it just naturally creates conflict.
In 2013, a participatory, multi-stakeholder grazing experiment was created to test a more inclusive way of managing these landscapes that balances production and conservation goals.
This project was set up with 3 groups of stakeholders. We have the professional agencies, Forest Service, NRCS, State Land Board, and then we have the ranchers, the people who their interest is really about utilizing the resource to grow their cattle. And then we have the wildlife sector, so the people that recognize how important the grasslands are to providing habitat, and if we lose those grasslands, then we lose those habitats.
This experiment is known as CARM, short for Collaborative Adaptive Rangeland Management. Half of the experimental grassland is subject to adaptive management, where the stakeholder group makes decisions about the grazing strategy based on past experiences, monitoring data, and current weather conditions. The other half of the experimental grassland is managed with a traditional approach for this region, and the results of these 2 approaches are compared.
What is most unique to me is the idea of giving these stakeholders complete decision-making power in the experiment. Most of the collaboratives that I've been aware of, particularly those working on public land, are usually you have stakeholders who are serving in an advisory role to a decision maker. But here it's almost the reverse, where in this normal situation, the researchers would be the decision makers. They would decide how to conduct the experiment, and that's how it's supposed to be done. But here we've given up that control, and the stakeholders have full power, and I think that's probably what keeps them engaged.
Many stakeholders highlight how much they are learning.
I think what keeps me coming back to the meetings is you learn something every second of the meeting.
I learned from everybody at the table. The science part of it is fascinating. The science team has done an amazing job of helping us get the data to the questions that the group has at a really quick turnaround.
I'm learning something that I can take back to my job and take back to the rest of the Nature Conservancy in Colorado. And so I'll come back into the office after this meeting and say, guess what I learned? Here's what we need to do differently, or I need to connect with somebody else who's testing something that we need to learn about. So I feel like I get as much as I give from this process.
You can't be in anything and not want to learn, and ranching's the same way. And to be able to go to that group and meet the people that have nothing to do with ranching. They never saw a cow hardly in their life, but they understand what our viewpoint is as far as we have to make money with those cattle.
Now in its 5th year, members are returning every year to participate and vote.
Over the last 5 years, I think that trust has developed.
People are getting to know one another more as people rather than as representatives of Organization X. And that's powerful because when you get to know people on a personal level, that changes the dynamic somewhat, and there's a lot of trust building going on.
There's a lot of respect, even when there's strong disagreements. And everyone's very open to learning.
The group I think, is fantastic to work with. Sure, I see thousands of birds out here every day, but to understand, that maybe they need a little shorter grass or a little longer grass or a little different species or whatever, and so that's been real fun for me.
I am incredibly hopeful that what we learn here can be applied more broadly, and I think it can.
We've built a lot of trust and things are moving in the right direction, but we definitely haven't figured out how to solve all of our problems. And we've been struggling with trying to achieve our livestock weight gain objectives and also our bird conservation objectives. And I don't think we know what the answer is yet. So I'm hoping that moving forward we can take our good process and move it towards creating good outcomes.
The future will bring many challenges in grasslands. Lasting solutions to those challenges will require successful collaborations. The CARM experiment is a unique opportunity to see how collaboration in rangeland management decision-making works and share those results with current and future generations.
Right, I'll introduce you. I should really say that Nick Dufek and Jules Cray at our ARS office are the producers and directors of this great piece of videography that you just saw, and they certainly had a great time putting it together through some Climate Hub money that we got through CCO exhibit. So yeah, so that gives you a feel for the people I work with. There's a huge group behind this study, and it's hard. We're getting a lot of data, so it's hard to fit them all in to just a half-hour talk or so. But yeah, I'm going to talk about hope on the Hardgrass and this idea of community-engaged research and common ground. The idea of building common ground. If there's any place in the world where we can find synergies between the ranching industry and conservation, it should be the shortgrass steppe. It's a place that evolved with heavy grazing from large and small herbivores, variable weather, fire. It's well set up for this kind of collaboration, and it just hasn't happened. There are a lot of reasons for that. I don't know how common the research context is across the West, but certainly the social issues are pretty generalizable in the sense that we've got multiple use objectives for our public land. We've got public land interspersed with private land. We've got growing urbanization. We've got drought. We need more frequent, more intense drought. We've got family operations, and we've got scientists that care about this stuff. Our research leader, Justin Durner, is a fifth-generation ranch kid. He's really passionate about rural communities, and he's put together a team of folks at the land grants and the ARS that are working on this from different approaches. So just a shout out to my co-authors. You saw some of them speaking. Lauren Perinsky in the corner, Justin Durner, Maria Fernandez-Jimenez at Colorado State, John Ritten and Jessica Wind at UW, Janelle Peck at the Northern Plains Climate Hub where I sit, and David Brisky at Texas A&M, and David Augustine, who leads the ecology on the project. Brisky in the green shirt, yeah. This project, I like to say that I'm a child of the rotational grazing debate, and Brisky is kind of a mastermind of some of this thinking early on. And then, of course, all of our partners. We say stakeholders, but they're really partners. So there's too many to even put them on the slide, but in the public land agencies and the land grants, and also NGOs. So I'll talk about their roles here in a second. But yeah, this idea of collaborative adaptive management kind of came from a couple of things. Those conservation issues and those livelihood concerns that they talked about in the video, and also this realization that we've been doing rangeland research on the shortgrass steppe for 80 years, and we were completely disconnected from the local community. We were essentially operating as a human exclosure. When range scientists came in and started setting up experiments in 1938, 39 here on the far western edge of the Pawnee National Grassland. This is land that was bought back from homesteaders that failed out 1937 onward. Federal government bought over 7 million acres. And Forest Service owned the land originally. We started doing research there. The first thing they do is they set up an exclosure, keep cattle out to see what happens, right? And that's kind of ingrained in our range science thinking. Well, we also excluded decision makers from our research. So we had a lot of great results. We had 80 years of experimental data, and it just wasn't jiving with what managers were telling us. And this came to a head. You may have seen some of the TED Talks and the debates in the range literature surrounding the rotational grazing debate, but it was time to re-engage in a meaningful way with not just ranchers, but with conservation advocacy groups, with public lands managers, our peers that we've been going to meetings with them, but sort of engaging them in our process, and with the local community too. So here's where we're at. Come visit me at Fort Collins. Here, I didn't put on the map for some reason, but this is the sort of the dry, warm edge of the Great Plains, right up against the mountains, and just like the video said, just a lot of change going on there. And I always give a shout out to BEMET 1969 because the work that was done at the Central Plains Experimental Range, where this project is happening, is really foundational to how ranchers and Forest Service managers have thought about rangeland science in this region for a very long time. And it was very productivist. Following the Dust Bowl, following World War II, the emphasis was to make the prairie more productive. How do we find this nice sweet spot between average daily gain and gain per acre? Leave 350 pounds of grass every year. Take that, what you have. Range science and range ecology and grassland ecology have gone through a lot of change recently, and Sam Fieldorf is on campus this week, and I really like to think of this project as a real living application of some of the heterogeneity concepts that are floating out in the literature. This is BEMET, yeah. And since BEMET, we know there have been a lot of changes that emphasize managing for heterogeneity across the landscape, but it hasn't been put into practice. So this is kind of Engeldorf live in some ways. So that's one way to think about the project. The other way to think about the project is that it's a new way of doing science and management for us. It's not new in the grand scheme of science. We know participatory work has been out there. You know, in this region, really, rural sociologists started some of this stuff right before and during the Dust Bowl. But it was time to re-engage with the communities in a more meaningful way. And we didn't really know how to do it, I'll say that, but we're trying. So here's the basic setup of our study. The Collaborative Adaptive Rangeland Management project really has three components. The first is this stakeholder group and research team. So we have 11 individuals that come to us. 4 of them are ranchers, so they actually get a little bit of veto power, I guess, because they provide the cattle. The cattle are provided through the Crow Valley Livestock Association. It's the oldest grazing association in the country on the west side of the Pawnee National Grasslands, and the steers that come on are part of that permit. We also have this ranch scale study design. So that's another criticism that a lot of the range research has to this point has been done at the plot or maybe the field scale, but not at this ranch scale, where there's a lot more heterogeneity and variability. So basically the idea is we have 2 ranches for each 10 pastures. Those 10 pastures are paired ecologically, and we give one of those ranches to this group. The other ranch is run just like the Pawnee National Grasslands. So the traditional rangeland management has a season-long continuous grazing. That's really what local ranchers do. And yeah, that's it. That's traditional management, May through October. On the CARM side, we let the stakeholders decide the goals and objectives. They get to choose the season-long stocking rate, and that's the same stocking rate on the other side. So that deals with a lot of grazing strategy research. Has confounded stocking rate and grazing strategy, holds those constant. Use of prescribed fire, stock density. So how many cattle do we put into one of those pastures? There's 320 acre pastures. The pasture sequence, and then also the pasture rotation triggers. So we have some vegetation height or cattle behavior or chronology triggers that they put into play. They're not out there making the decisions during the week. We have cowboys and cowgirls that check the animals and check the waters and do the monitoring, so they have to set up these triggers. In April, it's coming up here. We also let them name the pastures. And then data. Boy, do we have data. We have so much data. Yeah, I'll just describe it as kind of an army of nerds. We've got GPS collars and fecal quality, and we've got vegetation measurements on a weekly and seasonal basis. We have David Hoover has a hydrometeorological network out there with soil moisture. And the real challenge has been processing all that in an interpretable way for folks that are busy and have other lives. They get a weekly update in a cool infographic format during the grazing season. And then we have stakeholder meetings quarterly. So folks come to the station, we give them all those results, and we work with them on making the decision for the next year. And they set the goals. So the overarching goal of this project is to manage the land in order to pass it on to future generations. And this is where I start to get into my title of hope, where hope comes into play in goal setting. They also have 4 key areas of management objectives related to vegetation, profitable ranching operations, wildlife. Here we focus mostly on grassland bird species, although we are getting rid of prairie dogs in the experiment. We have other pastures where we manage with prairie dogs, but it's too hard to deal with them in the experimental setting. And then in 2015, the stakeholders actually decided to add a collaborative learning list. So we have goals to learn together, to build mutual respect, and to pass this knowledge on to folks outside, or to invite them in, I guess. So those are kind of the ways that we're thinking about managing, and a lot of our science and our grad students focus on these indicators, although we will have other side projects that pop up. It's easy to get distracted. Here's what the experimental pastures look like. So each of these yellow squares is 320 acres, and it's paired with a traditionally managed herd right next door. The cattle rotate among these yellow. The group and the cattle went on in 2014, so they set these goals in 12. We collected baseline data in 13, and the cattle went on in 14. And they set the order of that rotation, and then they decided that they wanted to rest at least 2 pastures a year. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And these dots are David Augustein's monitoring plots. The system is predominantly a loamy site, a shortgrass site, or a sandy plain site with some intermittent C3s. And we do have a little bit of a salt flat ecotone in the middle. Yeah, so this is kind of the timeline of the decision making. It gets really complicated. There's a lot of loops that go as people make decisions and learn things. But generally, yeah, the project started in 12, cattle went on in 14, and we started to notice that there were some trade-offs popping up in their decision making, that there's some complexity to this process. And it gets a little bit interesting. This is a visual interpretation of our hypotheses with those objectives. So in our traditional management, the system is pretty much designed to optimize beef production. Average daily gains are doing really well in the shortgrass. I think it would surprise some of you that have cattle to come down and see how well they do in the season-long continuous at a moderate stocking rate. It's pretty sustainable from a beef production standpoint, unless you hit a drought, and that's the big challenge. So folks on the Pawnee don't have a lot of buffer. They don't have a lot of forage reserve. Most of those folks don't have hay. They're either going to corn stalks, they're selling mother cows in a drought. And so that is a big concern. That can set a family ranch back for years if they have to sell their mother cows. But that optimizing for beef production definitely has a trade-off for the tall structure and short structure obligate birds. In this system, there are some species that need that tall shrubby stuff, and there are other species that need the shorter stuff. So the McCowan's long spur is a real specialist in this system that requires a very short blue grama. It doesn't really like to have any C3s where it nests. We call it the lizard lift long spur. It's the kind of pasture that a rancher would say looks terrible. So among pasture heterogeneity being an objective, we're not really doing well with that in the traditional system. And C3 grasses, it's a little uncertain. This gray is the uncertainty, but we're not doing super great on the C3 grass. Those are the cool season grasses that come up early in the spring, and they provide a lot of good forage quality. They provide good habitat for the mid-structure birds. Western wheatgrass is a key species for us. So what happened? This is the NDVI, or the greenness. So just to give you an idea of what we've been through. Drought being a major management objective, or we wanted to learn about drought. We unfortunately had a very wet period, so we're very blessed. We're not complaining, but we would love if it would get a little dry so we could find out what happened. So the black line is just the average NDVI over the last 25 years. How green was it in the system? And the blue is each year. You can see we were pretty wet 14, 15, and happen. And like I said, folks decided to group all their cattle into one herd, whereas our traditional is in the season-long continuous. They're also able to do prescribed burns. We burn less than a quarter of one of the pastures at a time, and we usually do those in the fall. And here you can see where we burned in sandy and in some of the loamy pastures. And the stocking rates, interestingly, every year they've gone up. So we started at 214, which is considered a moderate stocking rate. So 214 animals on 3,200 acres. Each year they increased that between 10 and 15%, and last year we were up to 280. So our stock densities also went up. We had 280 steers in a 320 acre pasture last year. And down here is the ratio of the number of pastures we actually grazed and actually rested. So they wanted to rest 2 pastures. The idea behind resting those pastures is to provide that grass bank in drought. They'll have somewhere to go back to, but also hopefully we could get some cool season grass production for resting those pastures. Maybe we can store a little bit of structure for the birds. So there's kind of a triple win there. And in 2015, we were actually able to rest 6 pastures. I'm not sure if that was a mistake or not. The ecologists kind of laughed at me when I put it that way. I don't think we meant to rest 6 pastures, we'll put it that way. But we did have some real heterogeneity that year. All right, so would you like to know what happened? Yeah, here's just a kind of an image of some of our stakeholders out in the field looking at that's kind of what the loamy ecological site looks like. We have a lot of cactus. So we'll start with beef. That's, you know, the thing that people in ranching are interested in, beef production, profitable ranching operations. If we can't get this conservation goal to kind of mesh with the beef, we're not getting anywhere. And the long story short is, no, our approach did not help beef production, but we learned something. In fact, it was a lot worse. These are the average daily steer gains on our project. So the orange is our continuous graze, that's the traditional, and the blue is the experimental herd. We're losing between almost 17 and 12% every year. This has been a big bummer for us. So as we move up in stocking rate, you can see sort of what that looks like for folks. And you can imagine a group of ranchers sitting around and saying, these are my steers that you've got out there. I'm not sure I understand how much I'm supposed to give here when I'm literally managing on the margin right now anyways. How much are you expecting from me? So Justin Durner puts this data together. That's why I put his photo up there. And Justin makes the point that we only weigh these cattle in May and in October. So we don't know what's going on in between. We've got some fecal quality data, but it doesn't tell a real clear story. So why is this happening? We think this is probably a result of the stock density. So we have like 280 steers in 320 acres. We have a high stock density. And when they're grouped in that big group like that, they don't really have the option to select a high quality forage that the traditional herd is able to select. You think of it this way: if you're not a cattle person, like the whole football team gets offered the same buffet, and at some point you're just whatever, just put it on my plate because I'm sort of in line with all these other players trying to grab it at the food. So Justin likes to use every single pasture at the experimental range. And so in the last 3 years, he's had a couple of side projects running where he's messed with the stock density. So he's got 2 other herds that are running. On the bottom here is the steer density for 320 acres. He's got a herd at 101 and 147 to see if you can understand kind of the differences. This is our TRM herd, average daily gain. As it drops down, average daily gain drops, 147. Here's where we are with our experimental herd, our CARM herd. We're actually doing a little better. I think Justin drew this in paint. Just to kind of think about what this relationship might be. But if it was a linear relationship, we'd expect a lot worse. So maybe this has something to do with that decision-making group coming in and thinking about and learning the landscape and learning about how to manage. Now, of course, average daily gain is not actually what ranchers look at. They look at revenue. So pounds of beef does not equal money in the bank necessarily. So we had a graduate student look at costs with different scenarios. You might have a big herd, you might have a big pasture that you cross fence, or you might have non-contiguous pastures. This is really common for young producers that are leasing land all over the county trying to get started. Jessica Wynn found that the large continuous system is has the least annual cost, while these multi-pasture, continuous, and rotational are the highest. And when we look at, when we account for the price slide and some other things in the cattle market, using a distribution of prices from the last 25 years, this is what our numbers look like with daily weight gains. The returns are not as bad, but we're still not doing great. So there's only 1 year when we account for costs and sort of the price slide that our collaborative herd is beating our traditional herd. So there's a cost to this kind of management relative to our conventional, and that's important to keep in mind. I don't know if we want to put a dollar sign on grasshopper sparrow, but this will help us think about what it means to ask ranchers to manage in a way that they haven't done in 80 years. Okay, yeah, and just a thought, you saw the NDVI, so we haven't hit a drought, and it's a bit of a bummer. We haven't been able to test that grass baking hypothesis fully, to say if you store some grass, are you able to stay out longer or not sell some of your animals? And we also think that would benefit particularly these two species, the grasshopper sparrow and the McCowan's longspur, by creating that heterogeneity. Stuff is well understood in the literature. It's not in the lexicon of managers. It's not how they think. It's not what we've been telling range students for the last 60 years. We've been telling them take half, leave half, right? So these trade-offs are kind of yet to be tested. How are we doing with birds? So we do have some heterogeneity. Kristen Davis is our graduate student at Colorado State. She just defended, and she looked at bird abundance. And this is kind of the classic heterogeneity hypothesis for this system. So across this spectrum of vegetation structure, we see habitat for a suite of grassland bird species. If for the last however many years we've been emphasizing this managing for the middle, we've got birds in the middle that are actually doing okay. Horned lark and lark-bunting are all right. But it's these birds on either end of the spectrum that are struggling, particularly the mountain plover, which likes prairie dog colonies or burnt vegetation, or the grasshopper sparrow, which I'm going to show some data on from the mixed shrub. And of course, precipitation plays into this, grazing intensity plays into this, and we should have prairie dogs. We normally have a little prairie dog and fire on the far side. To oversimplify a lot of complex Bayesian modeling that accounts for precipitation and topography, Kristen found that we rested the wrong pastures. So the McCowan's longspur, the lizard-lick longspur, it likes that short structure. Our rested pastures, which are these light gray, has a significantly lower McCowan's longspur density. That was a huge bummer. We managed to rest 6 pastures, and we didn't necessarily rest the right ones. For the taller structure birds, the grasshopper sparrow is here on the top. Resting does significantly increase grasshopper sparrow. So that's what we would expect from the literature, but here we're kind of putting it into practice. And it really just kind of highlights the need to understand spatial prioritization for management. So we grazed this pasture really heavy, and we didn't see longspur pick up there. They like these 3 pastures on the bottom of the station on the south side. And so now we're rethinking, okay, we want McCowan's, we're gonna have to focus there. And that's kind of a tough lesson for folks, because in this group, I think we're thinking, let's not graze the same pasture the same way every year. Let's not rest the same pasture every year. Let's mix it up. Let's move it around. That's kind of been their overarching approach to managing for heterogeneity. Let's not burn the same pasture every year. And here we're realizing these birds have site fidelity. They like this pasture down in the south, and we can't get them to come up here with just 1 year of grazing. Maybe you got to graze most of the C3s or those cool season grasses out of that pasture. Maybe they just like to nest there. We're not exactly sure.
You have to graze them out, remove them.
Yeah, the one place on the station where you find McCowan's consistently is the pasture we've had heavy grazing since 1939. There are some cool season grasses in that pasture, but not a lot. So, and vegetation, the long story short is no. Our management has not improved our C3 grasses. It hasn't changed at all. We know that our cool season grass production and density is going up across the station, inside and outside of our exclosures, something we're observing in other experiments. But just resting one pasture 1 year does not, kind of instantly improve our C3 grass. And Western wheatgrass is kind of the one species that we focus on that's sort of in every pasture. We can run this model on it and sort of understand those dynamics. And David Augustine, that's kneeling here, is sort of leading the charge on the vegetation dynamics. We are seeing more heterogeneity. This is just residual forage in each pasture in our collaboratively managed pasture and our traditional. So in the Loamy, the biplot variance, we've got 4 to 6 plots in each pasture, is higher in our collaborative. So we're creating that heterogeneity. Are we creating it in the right place? This chart doesn't always make sense to all of us, our managers, myself included. I think sometimes we have to get out on the landscape, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, and understand what this means. To see a pasture on a chart is really different than driving out and experiencing it together. And we were able to do some burns. We'll talk a little bit more about burns, but the burns that we did in the fall did have a benefit to cacti removal. So it burns the spikes off the prickly pear, and then we had quite a lot of pronghorn come in and just knock them over and eat the bottom off of them. And I think the ranchers liked that. They were a little skeptical of fire, but when they saw that benefit, there's a lot of cacti out there. So when it's gone, cattle can get to the forage a little bit easier. And then social learning. This is really kind of my wheelhouse. This is the last objective I'll talk about, and it's often underemphasized. JB and I were chatting about, like, where do social scientists look for funding, and sort of there's usually one of us stuck on the end of a project. And I think what we're learning is that investment in this, or this is my pitch lately, I don't know why that would be it, but investment in the social components of these projects is really important, and it's a little bit more than I think anybody even really anticipated. So we've studied early decisions that folks made early on. They revised their objectives, and we studied how that process went. And then the process of collaborative adaptive management. It's a thing that exists on paper. What does it look like in real life? And I think there's just a little bit of vocabulary that I'd like to kind of throw out, and we could talk about it. I hope it's a bit of a conversation. In this first paper, the first paper we wrote on CARM, just kind of laying out we thought we'll get one out there so we can cite it, so we don't have to write these methods up every time for the rest of ever. But we wanted to look at the early decisions, and one of the early decisions that was there was whether or not to burn. And this isn't a fire-happy ranching community. The shortgrass steppe is not very tall, and so folks are not eager to burn off their forage, not knowing if it's going to rain at all the next year. They might need that forage. It makes sense. But the first burn we did, all of the data showed a lot of benefit. The quality of the forage was higher. We got some mountain plover to hang out on the burns, at least. They weren't nesting there. It looked like a good thing from a scientific standpoint. And the ranchers completely block voted against it, wouldn't do it again. And it caused kind of this moment for the whole team. What do you mean? The science says this is a good thing. And so I use this word epistemology in the paper to kind of bring that into the range literature, to think about the different ways of knowing, or the different justifications that we have in management and science, and how explicitly talking about the fact that having 80 years of generational knowledge on the landscape is the same as a p-value for someone, right? So 80 years is as good as a p-value in terms of making that decision. They're not the same thing, but those different groups of people have different justifications for what they do and how they see the system. And if we always privilege science in that decision-making process, we're going to alienate some of those other ways of thinking and being on the landscape. And we need those rancher collaborators at the table because they know things that we don't. And then sense of place and hope. We just finished a fun little social sciences paper on these two concepts and how they relate to the objectives that we set. And I think that they're important to bring in because they're technical terms in some ways. So sense of place, boots on the ground, everyone says that. Where is the ground? But
this project could be seen as a attempt to reintroduce people to the landscape, to reintroduce decision makers into science, to think about what it would be like for a collaborative group or an NGO to purchase a ranch and learn how to run it. There's always wrecks in the beginning. If you talk to ranchers about the process of buying a ranch, there's always wrecks until they learn the system and learn the place. We started to notice that people were talking more when they're out on the ground, not in a classroom, when they're sharing food, when they're talking about pastures with names that they remember. And so building that has been a little bit of a process. This is the conceptual model that the NRCS and other groups use to think about grassland management. It's called a state and transition model. This is the state and transition model for the Loamy Plains ecological site. And basically what it shows is where we think your reference community would be. That doesn't mean you have to be managing for this, but historically what might be possible in terms of potential for this site. And what kind of management could you do, prescribed grazing, no fire, to move that into a different type of plant community. This reference community in the shortgrass steppe does not consider our grassland bird objectives at all. It looks something like this. And there are species out there on the same type of site that want a completely different structure and species composition. And if we're sort of thinking about it in a site-specific way, we basically had to create our own state and transition model that's relative to that place, the kind of precipitation we get there, the kind of goals that we want there, and the composition that we think we can achieve. And that's true of the heterogeneity concept. This is even more tricky. I think even for folks almost with more theoretical training in this had a harder time with the place-specific knowledge. You've got to get to know these pastures, right? This bird only nests in these pastures. Why is that? You can't just sort of mix it up in a conceptual, theoretical way in your head and apply it on the ground. It's complicated. Things go wrong. Can't always get to that pasture in that year. So that has resulted in us reprioritizing pasture level targets. So we have shortgrass targets we graze for McCallans now. That's okay if they don't have the C3 grasses. We'll try to get those somewhere else. And we have sandy pastures that we graze for taller. And at first, this wasn't the way we were thinking. We wanted to think at sort of a landscape scale. And that spatial prioritization of the birds is a big part of that. This was like an emotional battle. This was a struggle. Because if you're going to graze for McCallans, you're going to tell me I can't have my western wheatgrass, right? And we all kind of dealt with that. As we got the data in, and we had to reconcile it with these other ways of thinking. That reference community, oops, I'm going too fast. That reference community, is ingrained in the way we think. Sense of place. We need pasture level data for our cattle weight gain. So we're getting some walkover scales. These are going to be fun. So each steer is going to have an RFID weight, tag, and just like skiers going under the lift or whatever, we're going to be able to understand their weight gains on a daily basis and also check in on them if they take the water today. So these came from Australia last year, and we had a little bit of trouble getting them set up, but I think they're going to go this year, and I'm really excited to see this. So sense of place rather than that scale of May through October. And then I think there's a piece here with the local knowledge, and I think ranchers, whenever I talk to ranger groups, I say, watch out, anthropologists are coming for you. Because we've been everywhere else and we're super excited about what you're doing, and the Eastern Plains are going to get it. But it's true. The gentleman speaking to the group, I think it's his grandpa, built their ranch by taking his wages from the station and cattle. So this guy knows these pastures. He knows this landscape. He knows this community in a way that we can't just by showing up there. And he's able to share that sense of place and that scale of risk and that scale of weather variability with us in a way that's really reshaping the way that we listen. This is a listening project. And Justin has a great quote in the last paper where he says, it's hard to sit in the back of the room and keep quiet, but you got to do it, this type of science. Okay, and then Hailey's plug for Hope. So Hope was popping up a lot in my qualitative data, and I looked it up. Justin actually changed it to optimism throughout the manuscript, so I went back and I looked it up. Hope is the effective thought process of goal setting and attainment. It's not necessarily an emotion, it's a thought process. Optimism indicates, maybe it'll be a good year. Everything will be all right. Maybe we'll get there. Hope is actually kind of that will and the way to get around roadblocks and get to your goals. So as this group is working through some of these challenges and managing for McAllen's Longspur, thinking about how hard it is to make a difference at this scale, we only have a 15,000 acre research ranch. We cannot save the world from all the things that are going on. Development in Mexico, climate change, development on the Front Range, farming practices. When you really start thinking about a species like McAllen's Longspur and you only have 3,200 acres, you start to feel a little hopeless. What does it even matter? And some of the ranchers ask that, what does it even matter if we try? Are there any birds to come back? But in the end, they worked through it and they thought, you know what we'll do? We'll make habitat for them every year. And if they come back, they come back. If we graze it, they may come. I know this is so nerdy and wonderful because it's just so qualified, but let's create that habitat. And if they come, they come, and we're going to do it. And then we're going to hopefully use this as a platform to kind of have that conversation with the broader community. Let's talk with other ranchers. Let's talk with other conservation groups. And this combats what one of our folks called the apathy of scale in public management, that someone else will deal with it, right? I can't do anything on this tiny postage stamp of land. Why even try? And it's reasonable to feel that way because it is really daunting. But if you graze it, they may come. It's now kind of embedded in our objectives. We try to manage 20 to 40% of the station for McAllen's Longspur, and hopefully they come. And then next steps. CARM is a different, more complex and slower way of doing science. It's a great place to grow up as a young scientist because you're involved in this transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary group. But it's picking up some interest, kind of nationally and internationally, and it's connecting with some other networks. So, and I'm part of the USDA Climate Hubs. There are 10 of us across the country. We're regional boundary spanning organizations in the USDA under the USDA climate change programs. And so we're able to kind of leverage that network to get our information about CARM out there. We're also part of the LTAR network. Has anybody heard of LTAR? LTAR, they say. So there are 19 common experiments that are like our site. So they each have an aspirational treatment and a status quo treatment. Some of them are in cropland, some of them are in grazing lands. Not all of them have the human component in the same way we do, but we're all sort of working together to kind of think about these things at a different, certainly operation scale, and then with sustainability, food production and quality, and then rural livelihoods as sort of the core objectives. And then CARM is also linked in with this Agroecosystems Living Laboratories project, and that's a group of folks from different countries that are writing a report for the G20 chief scientists about this idea of working lands living laboratories. So Canada is going to put in 5 in the next couple of years, and CARM's been sort of highlighted as one way of doing it. Of course, it's an ongoing conversation, and I'd love to hear your thoughts and questions and pushback that you have. It's certainly a challenging way to do science. Slower, takes a lot more time, and I think mental anguish at times just to kind of collaborate across these epistemologies, but it's been fun. And you know, I think you know, for someone who grew up in a qualitative social science tradition, it's pretty critical and pretty skeptical of some of these participatory methods as being touted as a silver bullet. I am actually pretty hopeful that it's a good way to spend our time. So happy to answer any questions you might have. We're easy to find online. If you just Google adaptive grazing management, that's the fastest way to find our project. We're the first hit on Google.
Thanks.
Questions? Yeah, I was struck by, it seems like there's kind of 3 things that you're targeting here: kind of beef production and financial sustainability, plant diversity, and birds. what about insects, pollinators, mammals, reptiles, soil carbon? Or are there others things being looked at, or are these we're just?
Yeah, I think there are opportunities. We've done soil cores. We work with NRCS to sort of get baseline data for soil carbon. Pollinators are an ongoing question mark. I think if we had a scientist that was interested, that had funding, one of the other things about this is it's just a great platform for folks to come in and link in with the system. So,
Even with like the logo,
yeah,
got a cow and a bird.
yeah.
Right? Are birds the #1 issue, or are they the easiest to explain to people? Or
Yeah, that's a good question.
Keystone species that lumps in lots of other things that they're kind of representing. Why are birds #1?
Why are birds #1? Yeah, that's a good question. And I didn't even mention how we picked our stakeholder group. So that group is able to set the objectives. They did have obviously some, guidance from who we picked. We picked folks that weren't suing each other, folks that were in our networks, and reviewers are quite happy about that at the moment. But yeah, these birds are, of all the species of concern, probably the most of concern that's on our radar and that are on the radar of those groups. And I think it reflects kind of the interests of the folks working on the project and the funding that we have available to us, just like any research project. Yeah, but those other things are of course important. We did have an LTER site on the shortgrass and it closed down. So had we had that, I think a lot of those things would have been incorporated more explicitly into the project.
Can you use their data? So they have a long, good data.
Yeah, they have a lot of data and it's well archived, but yeah.
So get rid of those prairie dogs. That's what you said you were doing, right?
Yeah, we are controlling for prairie dogs on the experimental pastures.
Right on.
We do have 5 other pastures that are managed like the TRM that we do allow prairie dogs on those. So it's sort of a sub experiment. Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier in your talk that about having to sell off some cows to make ends meet, but then all of the data were about steers. So are all the cattle across all the treated stocker yearlings? Have you looked at, so the decisions that ranchers make, as you know, relative to producing steers is completely different from producing a sustainable cow-calf operation. Do you have any?
Yes, there are lots of big holes in a project.
Well, I'm not trying to
yeah,
poke holes. I'm just
yeah,
trying to say, do you also have like cow-calf herds?
We don't. We don't. We have historically in the history of the station, we've had cow-calf. One of the reasons I think that we've had steers in the recent is just to control it across and to understand the ecological dynamics, just to have stalkers across the station for every experiment. But yeah, it's a big limitation in terms of our ability to transfer anything we're learning, even to the ranchers on the project. Some of them don't have yearlings, and yearlings are not particularly popular. Most of the local folks are cow-calf operators. So yeah, it's a big challenge.
Metrics for success are
totally different. Yeah. Yeah.
If you're implementing adaptive management, I'm curious as to why, with decreasing performance, you would increase your herd.
Yeah, they were potentially trying to offset that. We were also in really wet periods. So when people were thinking about their stocking rates, they're thinking, we've got a lot of grass left out there. Like that one year that we rested 6 pastures, we've got a lot of grass left over. Let's munch some of it down. So that was kind of their thinking.
So the two were being.
Yeah, I would say that overall, and we talk about this in the first paper, even though the literature recognizes that density effect on declining average daily gain, it's not necessarily on folks' radar. So the emphasis was on add more cattle and rotate them faster and see if that can offset it, rather than mess with this density. The other thought was that the density helps us rest the 2 pastures. So there's a little bit of complexity in terms of putting it all together. Yeah. Yeah.
So what is the drought management plan?
Good question. So we have several trigger dates that we're looking at. So folks set the stocking rate before we know really what's going to happen. They have to set that stocking rate in October, and they can adjust it 5 or 10%
by April. So if it's 75% or lower of normal by June 1st, then our drought plan kicks in. And our drought plan would be to rest those 2 pastures first. And then if we need to, we can go back to other pastures and we'll use a VOR, visual obstruction reading, to decide if we can go in or not. So the idea is really, really contingent on those 2 grass-fed pastures. In the last 2 years, we actually grazed a couple of them for about 10 days because things happened elsewhere in the station. So that's the overarching plan. We'll keep the TRM herd out there until the CARM herd is ready to go home. So, yeah, in the back.
In working with social scientists and field scientists, what's been your biggest challenge getting them to work together?
Building a culture of perspectivism. So building this culture of like, can I take a walk in your shoes to understand how you're seeing these data, and that you might not think like I do in an experimental way about the landscape. That science, that a p-value may not mean a lot to you right now. And some of those things that come with the culture that we have in academia and working with ranchers, it's been a really fun process. I think the ranchers have stepped up maybe more than the scientists to try to learn about these concepts and appreciate it. They really see a value in showing up to the table and collaborating. They may not think the project is, I don't know if they think the project is gonna, help them stay on the landscape, but showing that interest in the project has been really important for them. It's a 2-step. It's a couple steps forward and a couple steps back, because there's a lot at stake for scientists' careers as well, right? And if somebody doesn't want to burn and we don't get that data, that can become a problem. So there's a lot of human management involved. Yeah.
I think it's a really cool way of doing science. Have you noticed any of the, or have there been any limitations from having 1 year of baseline? Like you said, there's legacy effects from the 40s for bird species, for example. So having like 1 year of control seems like it might be a limitation. Have you guys come across that at all?
Yeah, and I think in effect, we've drawn on the larger literature a lot, and our stakeholders are really interested in using that. So we have 1 year of baseline data, but we might have, 80 years of sort of understanding the system. That's really been key. But that's a really good point. And we also set our goals before we collected the baseline data, and NRCS has always upset us for that. Like they say, go out and do your assessment, talk with the landowner, collect your data, then set your goals, decide where you want to go. So, yeah.
Thanks so much. It's so neat to hear about the project. I'm wondering, and I may have missed it, but who facilitated the collaborative, and do you have any thoughts or reflections? It sounds like you created not only common ground, but some kind of neutral ground in terms of meeting, and what were the sort of characteristics of that space, socially or physically, or?
Yeah, we have a nice place that's out on the landscape that we can come to. We try to provide food, paying for a facilitator that can manage these relationships and rein in the ecologists and make sure the ranchers get heard. Just hasn't happened. So the social scientists end up doing it. I think that's a limitation to our social science in the sense that I can't collect data and facilitate. And so it's this constant battle to sort of figure that out. I wish we had a stronger relationship with Extension. We now have someone in Extension that's able to participate, but it hasn't always been the case. So those Extension partners are really key and underappreciated in such a core way. Normally this would be Forest Service facilitating this kind of thing. And that's another thought as well, is that they kind of ended up serving in that de facto translation role. And we rely a lot on people in the room who can explain cattle to bird people and bird people to cattle people. A lot of times we don't have to do a lot of it because they trust each other enough. And Andy that talked a couple times on the video, he said, come out to my branding. And we had folks from Bird Conservancy of the Rockies out at his branding. And, so sometimes it's offline kind of discussions as well. I think we're getting to that point. So it's not all kumbaya. I think it can get really frustrating and difficult, especially because there's a tension here between learning and managing well. So we can push the system and graze all those pastures from accountants and learn a lot, but we're not proud of ourselves at the end of the day necessarily from learning in that experimental setting. And so it can get challenging. I'll be around if folks have other questions. So.
Thanks.